He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're going to be getting into some atmospheric beast sightings as well as some UFO stuff. But before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as our Patreon, where you can get ad-free, exclusive, early episodes. You can also send us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. Now, before I get into the main topic, one last thing. I just want to say thank you. Everyone that's been tuning into the show and supporting it over these past months. We've been seeing a great increase of listeners, and it's just been fantastic to see the show grow. I say this a lot. I know I reiterate it on many episodes, but it's true, and me and Ruby can't thank you guys enough for just being there and supporting and listening to the show. It means a lot, and we're going to keep it up. We're getting into the fall season and the winter time, so we know that a lot of people are probably not really traveling as much, bundled up inside. You're looking for a good show, a good podcast to tune into. Well, we're going to make sure it's Cryptid Clues. We got a lot more cool topics that we're going to be getting into and a lot more encounters as well that'll be coming your way. So stay tuned because there's a lot more to come, including more episodes of Haunted the Grassman. Shoutouts to Ruben there for his hard work on that new series. Looking forward to seeing where that story goes and as I venture forward through the campaign that he's built. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into this. So today, I'm going to explore a little bit on the subject of atmospheric beasts. Now, you might be wondering what that is. Well, thankfully, you're in the right place because I'm going to deep dive into this a little bit. Now, it's not an alien spaceship, but an actual living creature that is basically floating around. And a lot of times, it's reported that they don't have wings. Somehow they defy gravity, as we understand it, simply by just floating, levitating, and moving around in the upper atmosphere. And again, sometimes coming significantly close to the ground, but never needing to really land or walk around or anything like that. They're always just floating through the air. Now, these flying beasts are often described as being fragile, lightweight, and partially invisible to the naked eye, as some reports come in that they're very translucent and you can actually see through them and see their insides a little bit. Now, their origins, however, are debated, and rightfully so, because they either have existed on the Earth all along or came from outer space at some point. Now, the alien component consists of a belief that these aliens swim through space towards other planets simply to reside in their atmospheres. In addition to the previously mentioned descriptions, their size seems to range in many eyewitness accounts, and in some, even changing their density, becoming smaller than larger, or vice versa. It's almost like a living balloon in some cases. But not all the atmospheric creatures are described as this. Some reports detail them as having tentacles, or even fins. So now that we have that kind of brief insight into these flying creatures, and a little bit of that painted picture imagery for you to kind of abide by, let's hone into a specific flying life form called the Crawfordsville Monster. Now, this was first sighted in September 1891 in the town of Crawfordsville, Indiana. This creature was described as about 18 feet in length and 8 feet in width, with actual fins along its body to help it propel throughout the air. Its body was white in color, and it had a singular red eye. And it had a movement that is reported as resembling a wind-shaken flag, if you can kind of picture that imagery there. And that it also emitted somewhat of a wheezing, torturing sound, which led people to assume it was perhaps in great pain. Now, as per the story goes, again, this is published by the Indianapolis Journal on September 5th, 1891, this creature was sighted by 2 ice delivery men, to which they described it as and I quote, horrible apparition, and exclaimed that it circled nearby homes, holding a consistent altitude of about 300 feet above ground. And eventually it did leave the area, but inevitably it returned, and this was more than enough to send these 2 men into a full-on retreat. And it just so happens that at this time, another man by the name of Reverend G.W. Switzer and his wife were actually graced with the opportunity to see this creature. And even more sightings followed throughout the day and even into the next day. Now, I mentioned on a previous note about how the creature seemed to be in pain. According to witness reports, it seemed disoriented on top of being in pain, and I quote, squirmed in agony whilst wheezing, end quote. Come September 6, 1891, the creature spent a large amount of time above the town, to which more than 100 individuals actually spotted it. Now, to just touch back on the 2 ice delivery men, I did some digging and found an old newspaper article actually associated with their experience, and I'll quote it here. It also ties into the Reverend's encounter as well. So I quote, "It seems that Marshall McIntyre and Bill Gray were not the only witnesses of the mysterious apparition which hovered over our city from midnight on Friday on till the dawn of Saturday morning. Several others witnessed the ghostly visitor and were also completely mystified both by its appearance and its actions. Reverend G.W. Switzer of the Methodist Church saw it, and his story is rather interesting. Shortly after midnight, he stepped into his back door yard to get a drink at the well. As he stood there, a strange, weird sensation crept over him, and although he is unable to say whether he was attracted by any sound or not, he suddenly felt his attention drawn upward. And raising his eyes with the full expectation of beholding something, he saw what both puzzled and astonished him. The night was very dark and very still, no breath of air stirring, but propelled by some unseen force, he saw sweeping toward him from the southwest the apparition. It was about 16 feet long and 6 feet wide, resembling a mass of floating drapery, shaped like a fleecy, milk-white cloud or like a demon in a shroud." End quote. So that's a pretty good little dive into what this thing looks like. And from their description, it sounds more or less like it could be a ghost, but we know it has these animalistic, I don't know if you would want to call it animalistic, but things that you might see resembling an animal in terms of how it's moving. And the fact that it is like a white cloud-like shape, and it just seems super light, and I don't even want to say flamboyant, maybe gaseous, but it just has this certain component to it that makes it more real and physical than a ghost actually would be. But this thing is obviously large, and it's moving around and is aware of itself and aware of its surroundings. And the thing too is these people feel this urge to raise their eyes, look at it, and maybe that's just that sixth sense that people tend to experience, because if something is looking at you for a long period of time, chances are you'll start to feel eyes, staring at you, and you happen to just look up and you seem to just hone right in at where you're being looked at from. Maybe that's the same case with this thing. But who knows? Now, Reverend Switzer did get a lot of follow-up mail in the wake of this. A lot of people were simply trying to figure out what he saw because they were just so fascinated by his experience and his witnessed account. So it was a hectic follow-up, post-experience for him. Again, he wasn't the only one that saw this thing, and I'm going to detail another account here right after this ad break. So we'll be right back. And we're back. So this sighting as well is attached to this September 5th encounter that Switzer had. And I quote, "It was about 300 or 400 feet in the air, and most gruesome in aspect. It was about 18 feet long and 8 feet wide, and moved rapidly through the air by means of several pairs of side fins, which it worked most sturdily. It was pure white and had no definite shape or form, resembling somewhat a great white shroud fitted over with propelling fins. There was no tail or head visible, but there was one great flaming eye, and a sort of wheezing, plaintive sound was emitted from a mouth which was invisible. It flapped like a flag in the winds as it came on, and frequently gave a great squirm as though suffering unutterable agony. When it came to be directly over the residence of Mr. Martin, it began to sweep slowly and majestically around in a circle. It hovered thus for some time, and then the watchers, fearing lest it was after their bacon, retired for safety to the shelter of the barn." End quote. And then we can see here where the information I mentioned on not all atmospheric beasts, but specifically this one, comes from these newspaper accounts. And I think it's fascinating because this happened over one short period of time, and then multiple people came forward and reported the same thing. So you get that reaffirmation. It's like what I always like to say, when you have a cryptid encounter or you see something that you normally wouldn't think exists, but you see it with someone who is with you, and then they can reaffirm, like, "Oh my God, did you see that?" "Yeah, I did. You saw that too?" "Yeah." And then you can bounce it off of each other, and you don't just sit there thinking, "Oh, my eyes must be playing tricks." And that's what is going on here when you got over 100 people that have basically seen this thing. Now, my last closing article here to kind of cap off this portion of the episode about the Crawfordsville monster is about, and I quote, "Postmaster Bonnell, who is receiving letters every mail from people all over the country anxiously inquiring about the spook, which was seen here last Friday night. The inquiries seem for the most part to be deluded fools and nearly scared out of their wits by what they think portends the approach of Judgment Day. One poor woman living near St. Louis writes a letter which would be pathetic if it were not so deliciously ludicrous. Concluding a terrified appeal for direct information, she says that she heard the same thing was seen in Ohio some time ago and fears it is coming west. She wants to know also if it can be seen in the daytime and what color it is. There is another class of earnest inquiries who may be denominated as cranks. They write a sort of "I told you so" letter in which they say they have been looking for the approach of the last day for some time and seem to take extreme pleasure in contemplating its near approach. End quote. That was listed in the Crawford's Daily Journal, September 11th, 1891. So it kind of like the fallout, everyone's reaching out to this paper trying to get information, and then in other articles you have people debunking this as birds that were just all flocked together. Like, so many people are looking for answers. And then you have these doomsayers that you're saying, "Oh, it's the end of times" and everything like that. Like, so there's such a convoluted amount of information now, aside from these facts that we can source from these few newspaper articles that were written at the time. But when I say convoluted, it's just so many people are trying to piece together what it could be that we just kind of drift farther and farther away from the truth, even though we have so many people that came forward and said, "Okay, this is what we saw." But then other people get in from around the world and start sprinkling in little bits of information. Maybe it was in Ohio, maybe it is moving west, or maybe this is just the first place that it appeared and the last place it appeared. It's just information starts to come disinformation, and it gets a little hectic, but I digress. Now that we've examined the Crawfordsville monster, and again, I would probably allot it more in that category of being an atmospheric entity, more so than a ghost, as it's been kind of referenced in some of these articles. Let's talk about atmospheres. Earth, of course, is not the only astronomical object that is out there with an atmosphere. Gas giants, moons, comets, and even suns all do have atmospheres, or at least can sustain one. And for you science aficionados, the atmospheric circulation of planets that rotate more slowly or have a thicker atmosphere allows more heat to flow to the poles, which reduces the temperature differences between the poles and the equator. I don't know how that's really relevant, but I thought it was actually really cool, so I wanted to just say it on the episode. But again, I digress. A reason I wanted to mention other planet atmospheres was the fact that we keep on capturing incredible footage of unidentified flying objects on the surface of these other planetoids, particularly our moon, and especially our sun. Now, the alien creature to spaceship comparison is, well, impossible for me to say because we either don't know or the information is kept as a closely guarded secret. And this leaves people like myself up to compiling evidence and speculate based on what I can learn and decipher. But referencing the sun specifically, Back in 2020, there's actually a UFO that is believed to be up to 25 times the size of the Earth that was spotted actually exiting from out of the sun. Alien hunter Scott C. Waring claims that the footage actually shows the UFO exiting the sun. And you can view this footage yourself. It's a compilation of images from NASA's Solar and Heliospheric Observatory. Mr. Waring states that the UFO is at least 25 times the size of planet Earth. Now, Earth has a radius of 3,958 miles, which puts this unknown object at least over 98,968 miles long. Gauging from the footage, and backed by what Mr. Warren claims, is that this UFO exited from the sun's core where it was feeding off of the star's energy. Now, the common theory here is that this is an alien craft occupying a hollow space within the sun, harvesting energy for who knows what's purpose, but who's to say it's not a living atmospheric form, something that just thrives off of that rich amount of heat, radiation, energy, everything that's just protruding out from that sun. To me, it seems plausible. But finding further evidence focusing strictly on atmospheric aliens does prove to be very difficult. And I attribute that to people just not necessarily knowing what they see. And the natural assumption too that hey, I just saw a spaceship. Now, I recently watched a film, I'm sure you heard of it, called Nope, and I do recommend it. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it sheds an interesting theatrical light on the topic of UFOs and UAPs quite well, in my opinion. In a way that's, introduces an interesting concept to UFOs that I wasn't fully aware of in the grand scheme of things until I watched this movie. Now, like I was kind of hinting at before, it doesn't really click for a lot of people, the concept of oh, hey, I saw this floating thing, that must be a living floating creature up there. So sightings become trickier and trickier to identify, fact check, and hone in on specifically. So I guess you could equate it as being similar to dozens and dozens of people out there that assumed they saw a bear, when in fact it was really a Bigfoot. I'm not saying it's all misidentification that's existing out there, but I bet it happens more easily than we realize. And of course, the lack of context in the situation doesn't help as well. If we see something flying in the sky, we might think at first a plane. Then you notice its movements change, abnormally so. That makes your mind drift to, UFO? But not in the sense of a living creature. I've probably reiterated this concept a few times now, but I'm just trying to explain and make sure I'm making sense, as I feel it can be a tricky topic that I'm trying to detail here. And I wish I had more information, however, on atmospheric aliens, but I wanted to let this episode serve as maybe a little introduction into this topic, because I will be revisiting it with Ruben, whom I imagine has a plethora of additional topics to discuss regarding this. Again, he is much more well-versed in the biblical aspects, which no doubt holds a strong position in association with atmospheric entities, I believe. So it is worth noting additionally that these creatures suffered from a lack of interest in the UFO community. More in-depth alien hunters actually stayed away from the topic completely, but this notion of atmospheric beings has still been mentioned here and there and isn't totally forgotten. It's actually been kind of seeing a little bit of a resurgence, I should say, lately. Now, I have another encounter here where a policeman was actually on his bicycle, and this creature approached him. Not the same one, mind you, of the Crawfordsville monster. This is a different atmospheric entity, as it's claimed. It came so close enough to him that he could feel it rub past him, to which he described the feeling as a soft blanket that smelled like mildew. The officer claimed it to be one of the most terrifying experiences he had ever felt, and was absolutely convinced that this was a living creature. To fully close out the atmospheric aliens portion of this episode, I'll detail what some accounts claim occurs when these things reach the end of their life. It's really quite simple too. They simply just fall to the earth, forming into a gelatinous mass that inevitably evaporates into nothing over a short amount of time. But to fully close off this episode, I wanted to explore a recent statement released by the U.S. Department of Defense on July 20th of this year. The Pentagon will soon be opening an office focused exclusively on investigating UFO sightings. And I quote, "This new office will be designated the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. It will act as a central hub that collects, investigates, and manages UFO reports and sightings across the Department of Defense, which includes the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force." This office's goal is to detect, identify, and focus on objects of interest, the key component being to investigate threats to safety of operations and national security. This includes unidentified space, airborne, submerged, and transmedium objects. End quote. And if you're unfamiliar with the term transmedium, basically it's an object that is something capable of seamlessly moving between land, air, and sea. For example, and you can actually view this footage, there's a UFO that's shooting out of the sky and just goes into the ocean. This was captured by the US Navy in July 2019. So these things keep becoming more prominent. Whether they are living creatures or alien-made craft remains to be seen for the most part, but we know that these things are becoming more prominent. So much so that we have Congress and governments putting out more statements regarding these things. And I'm not sure if people are really clicking into that, because should we be concerned? Should we be worried? Again, everyone has their own interpretation of what their perspective is on these things. But at the end of the day, the government is going much more public with these things. And I talk about this with other people in my life, and we kind of get into this kind of cryptic conversation. And often it's thought of, hey, they're just trying to kind of groom us for when it's going to happen, because it's inevitably going to happen. Again, myself, I do believe in aliens. You don't have to convince me otherwise, because I know they're out there. But it's interesting because how are we going to be introduced to them? And is this really the government just kind of paving the way to a slow introduction to them? Again, it's completely up to interpretation at this point. But between you and me, I personally don't know what's better, to be floating around above us or in the waters below, giant alien entities or giant alien spacecraft. I'm curious what you would prefer, so let me know in the comments or send us an email with your thoughts at CryptidClues@gmail.com. Again, be sure to check us out on our social media channels as well, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. So again, thank you for tuning into this episode of Campfire Clues. Stay safe and take care, everybody.